Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. We were so intrigued when you sent us that Wikipedia article on cancer. It's obviously a topic a lot of people want to know more about.
It really is.
And to be honest, it's something that even we were kind of intimidated by. Where do you even begin with something as big as cancer, right?
Absolutely. It's such a huge and complex topic, and there's just so much information out there. Where do you even start?
Exactly. So we decided to take a deep dive into it for you. We've been poring over the Wikipedia article you sent us, and we've got some other cool sources lined up too. We're going to try to break down some of the most important and interesting facts about cancer.
Yeah, and kind of cut through all the noise and hopefully give you a clearer picture of what we're dealing with here.
Exactly. We'll touch on everything from the basics, like what actually is cancer, to some of the more complex stuff, like how cancer cells actually develop and what causes them to go haywire.
And we'll even dive into some of the latest breakthroughs in cancer research, like those NK cell-engaging nanodrones you mentioned.
Oh yeah, those sound crazy. But first things first, let's start with the basics. So what is cancer, really?
Well, the first thing to understand is that cancer isn't actually just one disease. It's more like an umbrella term that covers a whole bunch of different diseases.
Oh, okay. So what makes them all cancer?
They all have one thing in common: abnormal cell growth. Basically, cancer cells are cells that have lost the ability to control their growth and division.
So they just kind of keep multiplying out of control.
Exactly. And as they multiply, they form tumors.
Okay, but wait a minute. Aren't there like good tumors and bad tumors?
Yeah. You're thinking of benign tumors. Those are the good ones. They're usually slow growing and don't spread to other parts of the body.
So they're kind of like a well-behaved houseplant. It stays put and doesn't cause any trouble.
Exactly. But then there are the malignant tumors.
The bad ones.
Right. These are the ones that can spread. And they can be pretty aggressive.
Like an invasive weed that just takes over everything.
Perfect analogy. And that's where things start to get really serious, because those malignant tumors can invade nearby tissues and even spread to distant parts of the body.
That sounds scary.
It can be. And that's why early detection is so important. But before we get into that, let's talk a bit more about those abnormal cells, the ones that are causing all the trouble.
Yeah. What are they actually called?
They're called neoplasms. It's a fancy word that basically means new growth. And it's a pretty accurate description because cancer cells are essentially cells that are growing and dividing in a way that's out of control.
Neoplasms. Got it. I always thought it was interesting that the word cancer actually comes from the Greek word for crab.
It does. It's thought to be because some tumors with their swollen veins kind of resemble crab legs.
I can kind of see that. So
Yeah.
back in ancient Greece, they were just looking at the appearance of tumors. Do you think that crab analogy actually tells us anything about cancer itself?
Well, it's a good example of how far we've come in our understanding of cancer. I mean, the ancient Greeks were onto something, but today we understand cancer at a much deeper level.
Right, like at the cellular level.
Exactly. It's not just about how a tumor looks, it's about what's happening inside those cells.
That makes sense. So speaking of what's happening inside those cells, how do we even know if we have cancer today? Like, what are the signs?
That's a really important question. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. The signs and symptoms can vary a lot depending on the type of cancer and where it is in the body.
So there's no, like, check this box and you're good kind of test.
Unfortunately, no. But there are definitely some red flags you should be aware of. Things like a lump or a thickening in the breast or anywhere else, unusual bleeding, unexplained weight loss, persistent cough, changes in bowel habits, and stuff like that.
So if I find a weird lump, I should just freak out and assume the worst.
No, not at all. It's important to remember that these signs don't always mean cancer. They could be caused by a lot of different things.
Okay, so don't panic, but
But don't ignore them either. The best thing to do is see your doctor right away if you notice anything unusual.
right. Get it checked out. Always better to be safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely. Early detection is key. But now I think it's time to tackle the big question: what causes cancer? And it's a tricky one because there's not always a simple answer.
So what are we talking about here? Bad luck, genetics, lifestyle choices.
It's actually a combination of all those things, but we can broadly group the causes into two categories: lifestyle and environmental factors, and inherited genetics.
Okay, so nature versus nurture.
Exactly. And believe it or not, lifestyle and environmental factors actually account for a huge chunk of cancer cases, something like 90 to 95%.
Wow, that's a lot. So that means we have a lot more control than we might think. But before we get into the specifics, can we just clear up one thing? Is cancer contagious?
That's a great question and something a lot of people worry about. Thankfully, the answer is no. Cancer is not contagious in the traditional sense.
So no need to worry about catching it from someone else.
Exactly. You can't catch cancer like you catch a cold. There are very, very few exceptions to this rule, and they're extremely rare.
That's good to know. So let's get back to those lifestyle and environmental factors. I'm guessing smoking is a big one.
You guessed it. Smoking is actually the leading cause of preventable cancer deaths worldwide.
Wow, the leading cause, huh? Why is smoking so bad for us?
Think about it. Cigarette smoke contains over 7,000 chemicals, many of which are known carcinogens. And these chemicals can damage the DNA in your cells, which can lead to mutations that can trigger cancer.
7,000 chemicals.
Yeah.
It's no wonder it wreaks havoc on our bodies. So we're not just talking about lung cancer here, right?
Right. Smoking is linked to a whole range of cancers, including lung, throat, bladder, kidney, pancreas, stomach, and even cervical cancer.
That's a pretty long list.
Oh.
Okay, so smoking is definitely a no-no.
Yeah.
What about diet and exercise? I know those play a big role in overall health, but how do they specifically affect cancer risk?
Diet and exercise are huge factors. Basically, what you eat and how active you are can either fuel or fight cancer.
Okay, so what should we be eating to fight cancer?
A diet that's high in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains is definitely your best bet. Those foods are packed with antioxidants and other nutrients that can help protect your cells from damage.
So lots of plant-based goodness. And on the flip side, what are some things we should try to avoid?
Well, studies have shown that diets high in processed meats, red meat, and sugary drinks are linked to an increased risk of certain cancers.
Okay, so maybe skip the bacon cheeseburger and soda combo.
Probably a good idea. But it's not just about individual foods, it's also about overall dietary patterns.
Like how much salt we eat. I remember something about that in the Wikipedia article.
Yes, high salt diets have been linked to a higher risk of stomach cancer. And it's interesting how cultural dietary habits can actually impact cancer rates. For example, in Japan, where salt intake is traditionally high, stomach cancer is more common. In contrast, here in the US, colon cancer is more prevalent.
Wow, so it's not just about individual choices, it's about the bigger picture of our environment and culture too. What about alcohol?
Alcohol, especially heavy drinking, is another big one. It's been linked to several cancers, particularly those affecting the liver and digestive tract.
So moderation is key, just like with most things.
Exactly. But the good news is that many of the things we can do to prevent cancer are also things that are good for our overall health. So it's a win-win.
I like the sound of that. Speaking of things that are good for our health, what about vaccines? The Wikipedia article mentioned that infections can sometimes lead to cancer, which I thought was strange.
Yeah.
But then it also talked about vaccines that can help prevent those infections.
Yeah, that's right. It might seem strange that infections can cause cancer, but it actually makes sense when you think about it. Some viruses and bacteria can disrupt the normal functioning of cells, and that can sometimes increase the risk of those cells becoming cancerous.
Okay, that makes sense. Which infection should we be worried about?
Well, for example, hepatitis B and C viruses can increase the risk of liver cancer, and the human papillomavirus, or HPV, can lead to cervical cancer.
It's HPV. That's the one they have a vaccine for, right?
Yes. There are effective vaccines for both hepatitis B and HPV, which is great news because it means we can actually prevent these cancers from developing in the first place.
That is good news. Vaccines are pretty amazing when you think about it. So we've got smoking, diet, exercise, alcohol, and infections. What about radiation? That's got to be on the list, right?
Definitely. Radiation, both from the sun and from other sources like medical imaging, can damage DNA, which we know can increase the risk of cancer.
So slather on that sunscreen.
Absolutely. Protecting your skin from the sun is crucial, but there's also a growing concern about radiation from medical imaging, like X-rays and CT scans.
Really? I thought those were pretty safe.
They are generally safe, and the benefits often outweigh the risks. But the truth is, each scan does carry a small risk, and we're seeing a rise in the use of medical imaging, so it's something to be mindful of. Always talk to your doctor about the potential risks and benefits.
Good point. Informed decisions are key. Are there any other less common causes of cancer we should know about?
Yeah, there are a few. Some workplace exposures, like asbestos and benzene, can increase the risk of certain cancers. And some hormones, particularly those related to reproductive health, can play a role in the development of sex-related cancers.
Okay, so it sounds like a pretty complex mix of factors can contribute to cancer. But the good news is, a lot of it boils down to the choices we make and the environments we expose ourselves to.
That's a great way to put it. We're not just passive victims here. We actually have a lot of power to reduce our risk.
That's empowering. Now, I know we've only scratched the surface here, but let's try to go a little deeper. How does cancer actually develop? I'm guessing it's a pretty complicated process.
It is, but I think we can break it down into some key steps. So remember how we talked about cancer being characterized by uncontrolled cell growth?
Yeah, like a cellular rebellion.
Exactly. And there are actually specific genes that play a key role in regulating cell growth. We call them oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes.
Okay, those sound important.
They are. Think of oncogenes as the gas pedal and tumor suppressor genes as the brakes in a car.
I like that analogy.
So oncogenes are the genes that promote cell growth and division, and tumor suppressor genes, as you might guess, are the genes that inhibit cell growth and division.
They keep things in check.
Exactly. And normally, these genes work together in a delicate balance to keep cell growth under control. But when things go wrong, that's when trouble starts.
So what do you mean by things go wrong?
Well, these genes can become mutated. Mutations are essentially changes in the DNA sequence, like typos in a recipe book. And sometimes those typos can have a big impact.
Like if the recipe says add a teaspoon of salt, but the typo makes it a tablespoon.
Exactly. So when an oncogene gets mutated, it can become overactive, like a gas pedal that's stuck to the floor. And that can lead to uncontrolled cell growth.
And what about those tumor suppressor genes?
When a tumor suppressor gene gets mutated, it's like the brakes have failed. The cells lose their ability to stop growing and dividing.
So that one mutated cell just keeps dividing and dividing.
Right, and as it divides, it can accumulate more mutations, making it even more abnormal.
So it's like a snowball effect.
Exactly. It's a process called clonal evolution, which is kind of like survival of the fittest, but for cancer cells.
Survival of the fittest. That sounds kind of ominous.
It can be. Basically, as those cancer cells divide and mutate, they compete with each other. And the ones that are most aggressive, the ones that can grow and spread the fastest, are the ones that survive and dominate.
So it's like a constant arms race within the tumor.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes cancer so difficult to treat. Because by the time it's often detected, it's already gone through multiple rounds of this clonal evolution. It's become a pretty formidable foe.
That's a little scary to think about. But what about epigenetics? I saw that mentioned in the Wikipedia article, but I don't really get what it is or how it fits into all of this.
Epigenetics is super interesting. It's basically the study of how genes are expressed.
Okay, but what does gene expression even mean?
Think about it like this. You have a gene for brown eyes, but that doesn't mean you're constantly expressing brown eyes. Gene expression is about which genes are turned on or turned off at a given time.
Okay, so our genes are like light switches that can be flipped on or off.
Exactly. And epigenetics is all about the factors that can influence those switches. And what's really cool is that those factors can include things like our diet, our environment, even our stress levels.
Wow, so our lifestyle choices can actually affect how our genes behave.
That's right. And when it comes to cancer, epigenetic changes can actually play a role in turning those oncogenes on or turning those tumor suppressor genes off. It's another layer of complexity in this whole process.
That's wild. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about how cancer cells develop, but what about metastasis? That's always been the scariest part for me, the idea that cancer can spread to other parts of the body.
Metastasis is definitely a serious concern. It's basically the process by which those rogue cancer cells break away from the primary tumor and travel to other parts of the body.
Like little escape artists.
You could say that. They spread through the bloodstream or the lymphatic system.
So they're just floating around in our bodies looking for new places to set up shop?
Well, not exactly looking, but yeah. And they often end up in places like the lungs, liver, brain, and bones.
Why these places?
Those organs tend to have a lot of blood flow, so it's easier for those traveling cancer cells to get there.
So once cancer spreads, is it game over?
Not necessarily. While metastatic cancer is more challenging to treat, it's not an automatic death sentence. We've made significant progress in treating metastatic cancer in recent years, and there are a lot of promising new therapies in development.
Okay, that's good to hear. So let's talk about how we actually detect and treat cancer. What are the go-to methods?
Diagnosis usually involves a combination of tests. Sometimes blood tests can detect certain cancer markers, but a lot of times we need imaging techniques like X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, and sometimes biopsies.
I've heard those biopsies can be kind of scary. Why are they so important?
Biopsies are crucial because they let us actually look at the cells under a microscope. We take a small sample of tissue and examine it to confirm whether or not the cells are cancerous. And it helps us determine the type of cancer, how aggressive it is, and the best course of treatment.
So it's like a sneak peek into the enemy camp.
Exactly. And speaking of treatment, the options really depend on the specific type of cancer, the stage it's in, the patient's overall health, and their preferences. But the mainstays are surgery, chemotherapy, radiation therapy, hormonal therapy, targeted therapies, and palliative care.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. Surgery seems pretty straightforward. Cut out the bad stuff.
That's the basic idea. Especially for solid tumors that are localized, surgery is often the first line of defense. The goal is to remove as much of the tumor as possible.
What about chemotherapy? I know a lot of people associate that with cancer treatment.
Chemotherapy uses powerful drugs to kill cancer cells. It's often a systemic treatment, meaning it affects the whole body.
And I've heard it can have some pretty rough side effects.
Yeah, chemo can be tough. The side effects happen because those drugs target rapidly dividing cells, which includes cancer cells, but unfortunately also some healthy cells like those in your hair follicles, bone marrow, and digestive tract.
So that's why people lose their hair and get nauseous.
Right. But there are ways to manage those side effects, and the drugs are getting better all the time.
What about radiation? How does that work?
Radiation therapy uses high-energy rays to damage the DNA of cancer cells. You can think of it as a highly focused beam of energy that targets the tumor.
So is it more precise than chemo?
It can be. The side effects of radiation are usually more localized to the area being treated.
Got it. And what's hormonal therapy all about? I know it's used for some types of cancer like breast cancer.
Right. Hormonal therapy is used for cancers that are fueled by hormones, like some breast and prostate cancers. It works by either blocking the production of those hormones or interfering with how those hormones interact with cancer cells.
So it's like cutting off the fuel supply.
Exactly. Now, targeted therapies are another really interesting area.
Those seem to be getting a lot of buzz these days.
They are. They're designed to attack specific molecules or pathways that are involved in cancer growth. It's much more precise than traditional chemotherapy.
So it's like a guided missile zeroing in on the enemy while leaving the innocent bystanders unharmed.
That's a good way to think about it. Targeted therapies are showing a lot of promise, but they're not without their challenges. Not all cancers have these specific targets that we can exploit.
Right. And I imagine cancer cells can sometimes find ways to outsmart those targeted therapies, right?
Unfortunately, yes, they can develop resistance over time. But despite those challenges, targeted therapies are a major step forward. Then there's palliative care.
I always thought that was only for end-of-life situations.
That's a common misconception. Palliative care is about improving quality of life for anyone with a serious illness, no matter what their prognosis is. It's about managing pain and symptoms, providing emotional and spiritual support, not just for the patient, but for their families as well.
So it's really about treating the whole person, not just the disease.
Exactly. Palliative care can be integrated into cancer treatment at any stage.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered the basics of what cancer is, how it develops, how we detect it, and how we treat it. It's a lot to take in.
It really is, and we've only just scratched the surface. But I think it's important to step back and remember that cancer research is constantly evolving. There are so many exciting developments happening right now that are giving us reason to be hopeful.
Okay, so tell me what's got you excited. What are some of the most promising areas of cancer research these days?
Well, immunotherapy is definitely one of the hottest areas.
Immunotherapy. That sounds cool. What is it exactly?
It's basically about harnessing the power of your own body's immune system to fight cancer.
So it's like we're training our bodies to be cancer-fighting ninjas.
Haha, yeah. I mean, our immune systems are incredibly powerful. They're constantly patrolling our bodies looking for and destroying foreign invaders, including cancer cells.
So why do we even get cancer if our immune system is so good at fighting it off?
Well, sometimes those cancer cells are sneaky. They find ways to evade detection by the immune system. Immunotherapy is about helping our immune system see those cancer cells and attack them.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So are there different types of immunotherapy?
Yeah, there are. There are things like checkpoint inhibitors, CRT cell therapy, and cancer vaccines.
Vaccines for cancer. That sounds amazing.
It is pretty amazing. There are a lot of really smart people out there working on some really innovative treatments.
That's good to hear. What about nanotechnology? That seems to be popping up everywhere these days, even in cancer research.
Absolutely. Nanotechnology is another area with huge potential. Researchers are developing tiny nanoparticles that can deliver drugs directly to cancer cells.
Wait, hold on. Nanoparticles? Like tiny robots delivering medicine?
Kind of. They're not exactly robots, but they're incredibly small particles that can be engineered to carry drugs or other therapeutic agents directly to the tumor.
That sounds like science fiction. Actually, that article you sent us from December 2nd, 2023 in Nano Today mentioned something called NK cell engaging nanodrones. What are those all about?
Oh yeah, those are super cool. NK cells, or natural killer cells, are a type of immune cell that naturally targets and kills cancer cells. But sometimes they need a little help finding their target.
So these nanodrones are like tiny tour guides for the immune system.
That's a great way to put it. They basically help the NK cells home in on the tumor and make sure they hit the right target.
That's incredible. I'm definitely going to have to read more about that. It
Yeah.
sounds like the future of cancer treatment is pretty bright.
I think so too. We're making huge strides, and I'm very optimistic about the future.
That's great to hear. But I think it's important to remember that all this scientific progress is only meaningful if it actually translates into better outcomes for people who are facing cancer.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's all about helping people live longer, healthier lives.
Exactly. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what all this means for our listeners. What can people actually do to reduce their risk of cancer?
That's a great question, and one I'm always happy to answer. And the good news is, a lot of the things you can do to prevent cancer are also things that are just good for your overall health. So it's really a win-win.
Okay, I like win-win. So what's at the top of the list?
Well, we've already talked about it, but not smoking is probably the single most important thing anyone can do to lower their cancer risk.
Okay, ditch the cigarettes. Got it. What about diet and exercise? Any specific recommendations there?
Focus on a plant-based diet. Eat lots of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and healthy fats. And limit processed meats, red meat, and sugary drinks.
Okay, so load up on the good stuff and cut back on the bad stuff. What about exercise? How much do we need?
Aim for at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise most days of the week.
Moderate intensity. Like, what does that even mean?
It means you should be breaking a sweat, but you should still be able to carry on a conversation.
Okay, got it. So move your body, fuel it with healthy food, and ditch the cigarettes. Anything else?
If you choose to drink alcohol, do it in moderation. And be sun smart. Wear sunscreen, protective clothing, and seek shade whenever possible.
Okay, got it. Protect your skin from the sun. And what about those vaccines we were talking about?
Yeah, if you're eligible for the HPV or hepatitis B vaccine, definitely talk to your doctor about getting vaccinated.
Okay, good to know. So it sounds like a lot of cancer prevention comes down to making healthy choices.
It really does. And, it's never too late to start. Even small changes can make a big difference over time.
That's encouraging to hear. But what about people who have already been diagnosed with cancer? What does the future hold for them?
Well, cancer treatment has come a long way in recent decades. We're seeing incredible progress in developing new and more effective therapies.
So there's reason to be hopeful.
Absolutely. We're making great strides. Researchers are developing more targeted therapies that have fewer side effects.
That's amazing. So what are some of the most promising areas of research right now?
Well, we already talked about immunotherapy, and that's still a very hot area. Scientists are constantly working on new ways to boost the immune system's ability to fight cancer. And then there's personalized medicine.
Personalized medicine, what's that all about?
It's about tailoring treatment to the individual patient. So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we're moving toward treatments that are customized to the specific characteristics of a person's tumor.
So it's like bespoke cancer treatment.
Exactly. We're using genetic testing and other advanced techniques to identify the specific mutations that are driving a person's cancer, and then we can target those mutations with drugs that are designed to work against them.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And what about things like gene editing and nanotechnology? Are those playing a role in the fight against cancer?
Absolutely. Gene editing technologies, like CRISPR, are incredibly powerful tools that have the potential to correct genetic defects that can contribute to cancer.
So we might actually be able to fix those broken genes.
That's the hope. It's still early days, but the potential is enormous. And as for nanotechnology, well, we've already talked about those amazing nanodrones.
Yeah, those are still blowing my mind. Are there other ways nanotechnology is being used to fight cancer?
Definitely. For example, researchers are developing nanoparticles that can deliver chemotherapy drugs directly to cancer cells, which can help minimize damage to healthy tissue.
That's incredible. It really does sound like the future of cancer treatment is very bright.
I'm incredibly optimistic. We're living in a time of unprecedented scientific advancements, and I truly believe we're on the cusp of some major breakthroughs in the fight against cancer.
That's fantastic news. But before we get carried away with all the science, I want to bring us back to the human side of this disease for a minute. We've talked about all the biological complexities of cancer, but it's important to remember that there's a whole other dimension to it, the emotional and social impact.
You're absolutely right. It's one thing to understand the science, but it's another thing entirely to actually experience cancer, either as a patient or as a loved one of someone who's been diagnosed.
Exactly. So let's take a moment to talk about that. What advice would you give to someone who's just been diagnosed with cancer or to someone who's caring for a loved one with cancer?
First and foremost, I would say, don't panic. I know that's easier said than done, but it's so important to remember that a cancer diagnosis is not a death sentence.
That's a really important point. It's so easy to get caught up in the fear and negativity surrounding cancer.
Exactly. And it's natural to feel scared and overwhelmed. But there's so much hope out there. We've made so much progress in cancer treatment. And there are so many resources available to help people navigate the challenges of cancer.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, there are countless organizations and support groups that offer information, guidance, and emotional support to cancer patients and their families. The American Cancer Society and the National Cancer Institute are great places to start. And there are many local support groups where people can connect with others who are going through similar experiences.
So no one has to go through this alone.
Absolutely not. There's a whole community of people out there who understand what you're going through and are ready to help.
That's so reassuring. What about the emotional toll of cancer? It seems like it would be pretty heavy, not just for the patient, but for their loved ones too.
You're right, it can be a lot to handle. It's important to acknowledge those feelings and to seek support when you need it. Don't be afraid to talk to your doctor, a therapist, a trusted friend, or a family member.
Sometimes just talking about it can make a big difference.
It really can. And it's okay to not be okay. You don't have to put on a brave face all the time. It's important to allow yourself to feel those difficult emotions.
So what about staying positive? I know there's a lot of talk about the importance of a positive attitude, but is that even realistic when you're facing something as serious as cancer?
I think it's important to cultivate a sense of hope and optimism, but I don't think it's about pretending everything is fine or denying the challenges you're facing. It's about finding a balance.
Okay, so be realistic, but don't let fear and negativity take over.
Exactly. And remember, everyone's experience with cancer is unique. What works for one person might not work for another. So it's important to find what helps you cope, what brings you a sense of peace and hope.
So whether it's spending time in nature, listening to music, connecting with loved ones, or practicing meditation, find what works for you.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it.
That's such great advice. I think it's so important to remember that even in the face of a serious illness, there's still so much we can do to take care of ourselves, both physically and emotionally.
I completely agree. And I think that's a perfect segue into our final thoughts for this part of the deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked about what cancer is, how it develops, how we detect it, how we treat it, and even the emotional and social impact of this complex disease.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
Exactly. But before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about the incredible progress being made in cancer research, but I'm curious, what role do you think each of us can play in shaping a future where cancer is no longer such a formidable foe? What can we do as individuals to make a difference?
That's such a powerful question. And I think it highlights the fact that the fight against cancer isn't just about scientists and doctors. It's about all of us. We can all make choices that reduce our own risk of cancer, support loved ones who are facing this disease, and advocate for policies that promote research and prevention.
So it's not just about understanding the science, it's about taking action.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, but action is what truly makes a difference.
I love that. Okay, so we'll leave you with that thought for now.
We'll pick back up in the next part of this deep dive with more about the future of cancer prevention and treatment.
Sounds good to me. See you there. Okay, so we're back. And last time we really dove deep into the nitty-gritty of cancer, right? We talked about what it is,
The cause.
how it develops, spreads, even how we treat it. I mean, it's a lot.
It is.
But, it's one thing to talk about all the science, but it's another to actually think about what it all means, right? Like, what does the future hold for cancer? Are we ever going to, cure this thing?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it's important to acknowledge that cancer, it's really, really complex.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not just one disease. There are so many different types of cancer, each with its own unique challenges. So I think when we talk about a cure, we need to be realistic,
Right.
you know?
So maybe instead of looking for one magic bullet that's going to wipe out all cancer, we need to focus on, targeted approaches for different types.
Exactly. And we're already seeing a lot of progress in that area. We've had incredible success with certain types of leukemia and lymphoma, for example. And researchers are working tirelessly to develop new and more effective treatments for all kinds of cancer.
Okay, so there is hope. And speaking of hope, what are some of those exciting possibilities on the horizon? What's getting researchers fired up these days?
Oh, there's so much to be excited about. Personalized cancer vaccines, for one.
Wait, personalized vaccines, like tailor-made for each person's tumor.
You got it. Imagine a vaccine that's specifically designed to train your immune system to recognize and attack the cancer cells in your body.
Wow, so it'd be like your immune system having a personalized hit list. Are we close to making that a reality?
It's still early days, but the research is incredibly promising. And personalized vaccines are just one example. There are so many other incredible advancements happening right now. Advances in gene editing, new ways to harness the power of nanotechnology.
It feels like we're on the verge of something big.
I think you're right. We're moving away from that traditional one-size-fits-all approach to treatment and towards a future where cancer treatment is more personalized, precise, and effective.
And hopefully, a future where cancer is no longer the scary, life-threatening disease it is today.
That's the dream, isn't it? A future where cancer is either preventable or, if it does occur, treatable with minimal side effects.
I love that vision. And I think that's a perfect note to wrap up this part of the deep dive. So far, we've explored the science of cancer, the complexities of diagnosis and treatment, even the emotional side of this disease.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn and discover.
Definitely.
But before we move on to the final part of this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. We've talked about all the progress being made in research and treatment, but I'm curious, what role do you think each of us can play in shaping a future where cancer is no longer such a formidable foe? Like, what can we do as individuals to really make a difference?
Wow. That's a powerful question. And I think it's so important because it reminds us that the fight against cancer, it isn't just about the scientists and doctors. It's about all of us. Every single one of us can make choices that reduce our own risk of cancer. We can support loved ones who are going through it, and we can advocate for policies that promote research and prevention.
So it's not enough to just understand the science. We need to take action.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, but action is what really drives change.
I love that. Okay, so we'll leave you with that thought for now.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some concrete steps we can all take to make a difference in the fight against cancer.
Sounds good to me. See you there. So we spent this whole deep dive talking about, the science of cancer, right? We talked about the genes, the cells, the treatments, yeah. It could feel kind of overwhelming, honestly.
Oh, definitely. It's a lot to process.
It is. But, even with all that complexity, I think there's something really amazing happening here. It feels like we're at a turning point in the fight against cancer.
I agree. There's a real sense of momentum, a feeling that we're finally starting to make some serious headway.
Yeah, and it's not just happening in those labs, It's happening out in the world, too. People are taking control of their health, making changes to their lifestyles.
Absolutely. And advocating for better policies, pushing for more funding for research. It's really a collective effort.
It is. And it's funny, we started this whole deep dive talking about how the word cancer comes from the Greek word for crab.
Right, because of how those tumors look to those early physicians.
Exactly. Back then, all they could do was look at the surface, but now we're like diving deep into the cellular level.
We're figuring out the genetic code, developing treatments that target those specific cancer cells.
We're even using the body's own immune system to fight back. It's just wild.
It is. It's like we're rewriting the rules of the game. And what's really exciting is that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what's possible.
Right. We've got personalized cancer vaccines on the horizon.
Nanotechnology delivering drugs with pinpoint accuracy.
Gene editing, potentially rewriting the very code of cancer.
It feels like we're entering a whole new era of medicine. And the best part, these aren't just ideas anymore. They're becoming reality.
Exactly. And they're already making a difference in people's lives.
That's what makes it all worthwhile, knowing that our efforts, both individually and as a society, are leading to better outcomes for people facing this disease.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's been an incredible journey exploring the world of cancer with you, from the science to the personal stories, the challenges, and the hope.
I agree. It's been a real privilege to share this deep dive with you and our listeners.
We've covered so much ground.
But ultimately, the message is clear. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about cancer, the better equipped we are to prevent it, detect it early, and fight back.
So stay curious, stay informed, and never give up hope.
Well said. On that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and ever-evolving world of cancer. We hope you'll continue to explore this topic with us in the future. Until then, take care.
See you next time.